So we had just finished talking about some of the challenges of collective action, as well as the way that we can reduce the costs of collective action, increase the sense of duty to take action collectively, which is incredibly important in a pandemic where our sort of individual actions have a larger effect than just on us. And what I want to talk about now is one key way that we can do that, which is risk communication. And this is only one way we can affect collective action, but it's a particularly important way. And we talk about risk communication. The World Health Organization defines it as the exchange of real-time information, advice, and opinions between experts and people facing threats to their health, economic, or social well-being. So it's about the communication of information about threats to health, economic, or social well-being. And the ultimate purpose of risk communication is to enable people at risk to take informed decisions to protect themselves and their loved ones. Right? So in other words, you can think about risk communication in the sense of a pandemic as one way we make it easier for people to learn about the necessity of collective action and exactly how to do it correctly, how to engage in healthy behaviors. And a risk communication isn't just sort of one sort of activity. It has multiple facets, and there are multiple things we're trying to do when we communicate about health risks like the coronavirus. First, we want to address uncertainty. Right? We have a rapidly changing environment for information. There might be some uncertainty in the recommendations we give people, but we want to address that uncertainty to increase people's trust in the advice that we give them. Because if you have somebody giving advice on public health and they're not trusted, it's not necessarily going to be effective. Second, we want to engage communities. We want to ensure that the message that you're getting about public health is something that you understand, right? The same message that's going to resonate for you as a student might not be the same thing that would resonate for your grandparents. So we want to increase the relevance of communication about risk to your own life. So we want to engage communities sort of on their own terms. At the same time, we want to have messaging that's unified. So in other words, we're engaging people on their own terms, in their own language, but we want to make sure that ultimately we're telling them to do the same sorts of things so that they don't get confused and so that they don't have confusing sort of perceptions of a health threat or health risk that's out there. And so one thing we're going to think about is sort of unified messaging and language choice as things that can improve people's threat perception. So the point here is that risk communication actually has a lot of different facets and a lot of different effects in the world. Now, risk communication is important because just because scientists can tell us what the level of risk is in the world related to some event like a pandemic doesn't necessarily mean that our understandings of that risk are going to line up or that we're going to perceive tolerable risks or tolerable threats in the same way. So just one example of this, which is that even as the spread of COVID-19 has increased, risk perceptions of engaging in some typical activities have fallen off over time. That is, people have perceived less of a risk to their health and well-being of doing certain things, including dining in at a restaurant, something that we know currently is still risky. In some cases, returning to a normal place of employment, shopping at non-grocery retail stores, in-person gatherings at the households of friends and family. Over time, even as the threat has increased, the sort of general risk perceptions in the United States of those activities being a large risk or moderate risk have decreased. So it's really interesting. And what's perhaps even more interesting is that Americans continue to venture out of the home at higher rates and engaging in these normal activities, despite the fact that they actually view these activities as being riskier than they did a month or several months ago. And so when it comes to actually how people think about the risk level of these various activities like dining in, they're actually a lot higher than we would think, given that people have increasingly engaged in activities like going out to eat, dining in at a restaurant, going and gathering in groups. So there's sort of a disconnect here and a puzzle. And I want to add one other wrinkle to that puzzle, which I think emphasizes the need for good risk communication, which is that we might imagine that people's perceptions of risk and their willingness to engage in activities that might be seen as risky is related to the actual level of risk in the world, right? In other words, if you live in a place where there's not much spread, perhaps it's totally normal and natural for you not to perceive much risk. That makes sense. But the really interesting thing is that when you look at the responses of people and the actual spread of COVID-19 in their communities, you don't see much of a relationship. So this is from some research by some political scientists and others at Northwestern University. And what they do is, among other things, they look at people's perceptions, their worry about COVID, changes in their behavior related to the pandemic, support for COVID policies, and they look at how that varies according to the number of cases in the county that that person lives in. And what you see here, and you can see this when you look at other sort of units of analysis like neighborhood or city, which is that there's not much of a relationship. There's a slight positive relationship between the sort of density of cases in your area and your changes in behavior, like your changes in whether or not you're engaging in more social distancing, for example. But it's not an especially great relationship. You'll notice that these lines here are pretty flat. And so it's not the case that simply if you live in an area where there is more risk, you're going to perceive that risk just because there's more of it, right? COVID, like a lot of health risks, is not immediately visible, right? You might go outside and see people wearing masks and you see other people perceiving the risk, but it's not as if you're walking outside and it's like the wildfires in California where you are actually seeing visible particulate in the air. So it's hard to perceive. And so you see this sort of flat relationship between the density of cases and people's attitudes and behaviors. So this is why risk communication matters, because risks are not always easily perceived. Now, risk communication is even harder during COVID-19 for a few reasons that Sarah Gollust and her co-authors outline in the piece that you guys read for this week. And I want to just go through a few of those here because I think they're going to become important to our discussion of this as we go along. The first is that COVID-19 is a novel threat, right? We've had other pandemics before. There are, of course, infectious diseases, but the particular nature of the virus is novel. We don't have a vaccine. Knowledge about it certainly at the outset was pretty limited. And so often when we have situations like that, and there's limited knowledge about something in the world, people's perceptions of, say, the level of risk, what they should do, they tend to rely on cues from political elites. And this is not just true in the case of COVID, but there are other novel health crises where this is the case, that in the absence of a lot of information to rely on, a sort of well-known health issue like the flu, for example, and there's limited knowledge, people tend to rely on cues from political elites. And so when there's polarization among the political elites, as we're going to see in a second, that can become really challenging because there might not always be a consistent message. Second, something that makes it even harder, and I'm sure that many of you might have experienced this as I have, which is that the science on COVID-19 is rapidly evolving. If you go into scholar.google.com and search COVID-19, you will see numerous research studies appear every day in a variety of fields, so many that it can be difficult to keep up and sort of track what's going on. This also means there are frequent changes in guidelines and understandings of what is best to do. For example, the CDC guidelines on mass testing that sort of affect decisions that institutions make about how many people they're going to test or whether or not they're only going to test symptomatic cases are kind of contradictory. And they seem to go against things that the CDC had said before. Why is that? It's not entirely clear. But one thing is that when you have rapidly evolving science and information, it becomes difficult for people to know exactly what kinds of behaviors they should engage in. And that can contribute to some of the challenges of risk communication, because you don't want to portray a level of certainty that you don't have, because that might lead to mistrust. At the same time, you want to communicate clearly enough to people so they understand what to do. And that can be difficult when there's scientific uncertainty involved. Third, there are, in many cases, conflicting messages from political elites, especially when it comes to threat severity. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But when that's the case, and especially when people are well sorted into particular political parties or belief systems, it can become difficult to gain consensus on how severe a threat is, even when, at least where scientific knowledge is concerned, it might be clear. Two other things that make perceiving threat severity difficult. The first is that, especially during the early days of the pandemic, fear and anxiety ran high. And one thing we know from social psychological studies is that when fear and anxiety run high, people search for information, which is great. You can look at Google searches during the pandemic, and Google search for COVID-19 sort of explodes in March. So it's good. People look for information. But sometimes people look for information that confirms their prior beliefs, especially when there's fear and anxiety involved. And when you're looking for information only that confirms your prior beliefs, you might ultimately not see information that is relevant or clear about the true level of the threat. And we'll talk about that when we talk about motivated reasoning in the final part of the lecture. Finally, another challenge of risk communication is that there's fragmentation in the media landscape. It's not the case as in the sort of middle of the 20th century that when the CDC communicates something about risk, it goes out to 3 or 4 major news networks and several major publications across the country. We have an incredibly fragmented media ecosystem. People use social media increasingly, as well as even just an increasingly divided sort of cable news infrastructure, which means that just because there's one clear message, it might not be received in only one way. And this is something that, at least within government or within public health institutions, can be really difficult because you don't necessarily have a lot of control over the way that your message is going to be received. And there's some very clear implications of this when we look at some of the recent evidence on COVID-19. The first is a study conducted by some researchers at Ohio State of tweets sent out by members of Congress. So in the early part of the year, these scholars studied 30,000 tweets sent out by members of Congress and looked at whether or not they tweeted about COVID. And what they saw was a major sort of partisan divergence in tweets about the virus. Democrats tended to tweet sort of earlier and with more intensity than Republicans immediately after the first outbreak was identified in California. So there was a sort of partisan divergence that set in pretty quickly. And what's perhaps even more interesting is in this study, they try to identify party by looking at differences in the kind of words and messages that these tweets send out. And the way that they see how different the parties are in their language is they try to see how accurately they can predict which party is tweeting by which words they're using. And by March, you can get about 75% accuracy pretty closely on predicting the party of the person who's tweeting just by looking at the words that they're using, which suggests that we're seeing very different messages about threat severity and the nature of the pandemic, depending on whose tweets you're reading with more regularity. And there's some evidence that, at the very least, this cueing on the actions of partisan elites actually does have an effect on people's health behavior. So there's another study that was done by researchers at NYU and Columbia. And what they did was looked at the average number of people sheltering in place in every county in the country. And this is during the early weeks of the pandemic back in March. And what they did was they used de-identified or confidential GPS data to look at where people were moving, the sort of extent to which people were leaving their house. And so when you see darker red colors here, that means people are staying put more, sheltering in place more, which during the early weeks of the pandemic was especially important, seemed especially important to reducing spread. So you see a major increase across the country of people sheltering in place. But what you do see is a large gap in where people are sheltering in place. And so what the researchers did was they looked at sheltering in place behavior by the partisan context of each county. So they looked at counties where there were a 30% vote share for President Trump in 2016 and a 70% vote share for Trump in 2016. What they saw is that while sheltering in place increased sort of across the board and followed really the same pattern in both types of counties, there was a pretty significant gap between them, which suggests that, at least in part, the behavior related to sheltering in place is based on cues that people are receiving from partisan elites, which suggests that it's not as simple as simply communicating about risk and assuming that people are going to get the message in the same way, that there is a sort of politics to risk communication that is really important and that affects the way that people perceive risk. So what ultimately we're going to talk about by the end of the lecture is, how do we deal with that fact? Or if that might be a barrier or inhibit risk perception, how do we negotiate that? And ultimately, one thing that we're going to talk about as being especially important here, one of the most important things that we do when we communicate about risk is framing, right? And when we talk about framing, what we mean is just the process of defining an issue or debate, right? So if you think about any issue related to public health, and you just sort of take a look at it in Google Scholar, you're going to see most public health issues are complex, right? And they're multidimensional, right? COVID-19 is not just a pandemic. There is an economic dimension to it, to the crisis. There's a political dimension to it, and there's a social dimension to it in the sense that it's changing the way that we live in our social lives. So it's a really big, complex issue. And when we frame, we try to define that issue or draw a frame around it, if you will, in a particular way. And when we frame an issue, we use both empirical information, information maybe about the level of the risk or the severity of the threat, but we're also using symbolic language, right? Most people don't read scientific papers for fun, and even if they did, just reading them might not reshape their behavior. But when we frame something, we're usually using empirical information, but we're tying it to symbolic language that emphasizes one or more dimensions of an issue or problem. So the example I like to use is this poster that was prominent in the city of Philadelphia back in the 1918 pandemic, which says "Spit spreads death." And you can actually buy a mask now that says "Spit spreads death" from the Motor Museum in Philadelphia. But if you think about this poster, it includes both empirical information, information about the necessity of wearing a mask, covering your mouth, and so on, and the need to do that to stop the spread of the virus. But it's also, if you notice, it doesn't say like it's a good idea to wear a mask. It frames the choice in very stark terms that if your spit gets out into the world, you will be the spreader of death. And so it's including symbolic language as well as sort of empirical information because it's trying to change people's behavior, and you need, in a way, to emphasize things that will resonate with people. And one thing that we know is that effective message frames can shape health behaviors. Now, they can shape health behaviors for better or worse. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the important thing to note is that the language that we use matters. And the language that we use can really affect the way that people engage in health behaviors. And political and social science has done a lot of work in showing this. So let me give you one example that I think really clearly illustrates the effectiveness of framing. Now, it's not going to be about a pandemic, but it is something about something that really affects or had an effect on health. So we go back to the early 1970s, 1970 and 71. There was a military operation in the United States called Operation Red Hat. And this operation was designed to take canisters of nerve gas, so really, really toxic, poisonous gas like sarin, VX, mustard gas, that were sitting on the island of Okinawa, and take those canisters and repatriate them to the United States, right, to decommission them. And the idea was initially to take these canisters, put them on a train, and bring them to the Umatilla Army Depot in Oregon. Well, of course, that train was going to be going through a lot of people's towns, and Senator Warren Magnuson of Washington State got wind of that, and his constituents started writing to him and were very appropriately freaked out about that. And so he wrote an amendment in the Senate and tried to get the Nixon administration at the time to not send those canisters into Oregon. And they said, fine, that's all right, we'll send them to Alaska. At which point, Senator Mike Gravel of Alaska raised the same sort of alarm. And the initial way that Magnuson and Gravel talked about this issue was really as the problem of something that would affect their constituents. So I want to just give you an example of how they started talking about this issue. This is Magnuson's speech in the Senate. He said that, quote, "The real danger comes in the process of transit, being unloaded in the United States and then loaded into railway cars for a lengthy trip through an area heavily populated with people who are very upset about this activity." He's talking about his constituents who are writing him appropriately freaked out letters. Now, you'll notice that the way he talked about this issue was really about the train with the canisters on it coming through the United States and affecting his constituents or Gravel's constituents. It might have mattered to his constituents in this way. They might have understood this, but most of his colleagues in the Senate did not. And so if you look at the initial positions of his colleagues in the Senate on this amendment that he and Gravel put forward to stop this from happening, they didn't get a lot of support. There were 24 opponents, people who were pretty clearly opposed, people in the Senate who supported the Nixon administration. There were 67 members of the Senate who were undecided or really indifferent to the issue. Why? Not because they were bad people necessarily, but because the train wasn't going through their home states or their districts. And then they had 9 supporters, all of whom were from the Pacific Northwest or Alaska. So while his initial framing of this issue made sense to his constituents, it didn't really appeal to the people he needed to persuade. in order to pass his amendment to stop this train from leaving the station. So what did Magnuson do? Well, he tried to find issues that would appeal to his colleagues in the Senate. He didn't change his amendment. He didn't alter its contents. But what he did was he reframed the way that he talked about it. And what he did was he tried to connect it to other issues, specifically to the issue of the Senate's power versus the power of the executive branch. And he knew that this would appeal not only to members of the Senate who opposed the Vietnam War, which is increasingly unpopular at the time, but it would also appeal to members of the Senate who had been there a while and really were interested in preserving the Senate's power to ratify treaties. So this is the way that he reframed his appeal, and when he proposed Magnuson-Gravel Amendment, talked about it. Now I want you to notice what's not in this language. He says, the Senate passed a resolution, the Byrd Amendment, declaring that before the president has made any disposition of Okinawa, it's where the shells are being kept, he should come to the Senate. But that resolution was completely ignored. In the meantime, this agreement on nerve gas was made. It was an agreement of great importance about which the Senate was not consulted. It comes close to being, if it is not in fact, an unconstitutional usurpation of the Senate's power to ratify treaties. Okay. Notice what's not in that frame. He doesn't talk at all about the train going through the country. He doesn't talk at all about his constituents or even the effects of nerve gas. It's not about that, right? He knows that to appeal to those members of the Senate that might not care about this because it doesn't affect their constituents, he has to talk about something it does affect, which is the power of the Senate to ratify treaties. Now, after he had reframed the appeal this way, I want to show you what happened on the final vote. So you had 7 members of the Senate who were not there for the vote, so we'll just cross those out. You had 40 opponents, right? The initial opponents, there were 24, and then 16 more members of the Senate who were initially undecided, but who ultimately leaned towards the Nixon administration's position on this. But then he ultimately got 52 supporters. Remember, he started with 9. So who were these people? You had the initial 9 regional votes. You had 33 votes of anti-administration, basically anti-Vietnam War senators, right? Again, because he had reframed this around the Nixon administration rather than the train itself. And then he had an additional 10 senior members of the Senate, some of whom supported the Vietnam War, but who really were intent on preserving the Senate's power to ratify treaties. Again, they didn't necessarily care about the train, just like the Vietnam War opponents didn't necessarily care about the train. Now, he didn't appeal to everyone in the Senate, and that's rarely something that happens, right? But he was able to get a 52-40 final vote in favor. And remember, he just started with 9 votes. And he didn't get this by bargaining, wheeling and dealing, trading votes on other pieces of legislation, or even changing the text of his own bill. He got it simply by changing his language, right? And that shows you in a way how powerful language can be when we're trying to make appeals. So what made Magnuson's framing so effective? Well, there's 3 or 4 really important things that when you guys do your annotation assignment, when you look at this op-ed, you're going to be trying to extract. But there's 4 things that the research on framing tells us about what makes it effective. Right? The first thing is that an effective frame ties narrow issues to an anchoring frame that resonates with beliefs and values that the target population, the people you're trying to influence, already hold. So remember that Magnuson, his constituents, they really just cared about the train. Magnuson knew he didn't have to appeal to them. They already cared. He had to appeal to people that didn't necessarily care about this issue. And so he had to tie it to an anchoring frame, right? A big issue that resonated with the beliefs and values of those other senators. And this was about the abuse of executive power and the Vietnam War. And that's true generally when we frame that often we have to tie a narrow issue, right, something that might be very complicated and complex, to something that is a broadly held value of the audience that we're trying to influence. And when you guys look at posters related to the pandemic, you might see those sorts of messages in public health posters, right? When you see a poster that tells you or reminds you to wear a mask, it doesn't give you all of the scientific details on why it's important. It says that it's your responsibility, where it says, if we want to get through this and have a better 2021, this is what we have to do. So it appeals to this sort of broader resonating beliefs. The second thing that makes the frame effective is bridging. And when we say bridging, we mean is including new elements that bolster the anchoring frame. And for someone like Magnuson, he's talking about an issue that people already knew about, right? This Byrd Amendment that was about the ratification of treaties and try to protect the Senate's power to do that. So he's taking this new element. It had nothing to do necessarily with the details of the train going through the United States, but it was an element that sort of bolstered his anchoring frame about the abuse of executive power. Third, and we'll come back to this later in the lecture, it's important not just the message, but the messenger, right? Good messages are delivered by trusted sources, right? It might not have been appealing if some random person had just come into the Senate and started talking about the importance of passing this amendment, but Magnuson was a trusted and respected member of the Senate, really by both parties. And so he was able to deliver this message effectively because of who he was, not just the message that he was sending out there. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, he employed a causal sequence. Causal sequence helps describe what's causing the problem and what we can do to change it. So if you think about a pandemic poster that says something like, if we want a better 2021, we have to, wear our masks or something along those lines. I'm not an advertising executive, so probably is more pithier than that. It's showing you the causal sequence. If we do this, then the following thing will happen. And that's really what you do in a good frame. You describe the initial factor or imply the initial factor in some way. And for Magnuson, he's trying to appeal to people by saying the real problem here is not just the train, but the abuse of executive power. Right? So that's the sort of initiating condition. At the end, he's talking about the final consequences. So what's the bad thing that might result from an abuse of executive power? Nerve gas going through the country, a weaker Senate, maybe prolonged war. Those are sort of the final consequences, the things you'd like to avoid, right? You'd like to avoid being in social distancing for like the next 3 or 4 years. But the most important part of the causal sequence is the middle term. In other words, it's the thing that you have to do in order to avoid the negative final consequences. And for Magnuson, that's treaty ratification without Senate consent, right? That's the thing that's causing the negative final consequences. And if you want to avoid that, you have to pass his amendment. Similarly, if you see a poster that says, mask up for a better 2021, the implication is that if you want to avoid those negative final consequences, you have to do something different. You have to engage in a particular kind of behavior. And so when we think about what makes a frame effective, it's not just about appealing to the values that people hold. That's really important, right? You can't just assume that people are going to understand that this is the science of COVID-19 and therefore follow it. You have to appeal to values that people hold and meet them where they are. But another thing that political science tells us is that the source matters too. Like, who is in the ad, who's delivering the message, also matters. If you have somebody that your audience doesn't trust, it's not going to be an effective message. And finally, with the causal sequence, it really matters that you tell people what they have to do in order to bring about a different set of final conditions. And in the case of this particular instance with Magnuson, it was passing his amendment. In the case of public health and pandemic managements, usually engaging in public health behaviors. So when we come back, we're going to talk about how frames can affect public health behaviors with respect to COVID-19. So now we're going to take a break, and you can complete questions 4 through 6 in the quiz. Take the break that you need and come back to the third and final part of the lecture. This is the end of part 2 of lecture 4. So we'll see you all back